As you know, I'm Arpit, and today I'm chatting with Schaun, and we're here to talk about content management systems or CMSs and how the data that resides in your CMS can be leveraged for personalization purposes. Is that right, Schaun?
Yeah, I think so. They've been around for a long time, and I think a lot of people are giving them a new look now,
Yeah.
especially with the advent of generative AI, where you don't have to confine yourself to these static filling in your boxes of your content. You can actually be a little bit more fluid in what you fill in those boxes with and then how you deliver that to your users. So there's lots of developments in the CMS space right now that aren't necessarily being captured when you look at the actual CMS tools out there, but when you look at how they're actually being used, how they can be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a topic that's really close to my heart because I am a power user of so many CMSs, and I always think about how to better structure the CMS so that, the data that's there can actually be used for more than just, for the purpose of showing content on a web page. So yeah, when I proposed this series to you, and we were thinking about this whole series, you suggested we devote a whole episode to talk about CMSs. So can you talk a little bit about why this topic warrants that much attention? Like you mentioned, CMS technology has been around for a long time, but there have been new developments. And so what are those? Like, I'm sure people would love to know what are those developments. And do you also just view CMS differently than other people do? I think you do, but yeah.
Yeah, CMSs, in my experience, are often viewed as sort of parking lots.
Yeah.
You put in your content into there, and then that populates your product pages on your website or whatever. Like it's just a way for you to be able to template presentation of content. And that use of a CMS is comparable to kind of the old mail merge type of email marketing, where you may put in a person's first name and then that's the only personalized thing, and then you just send it out to everyone. It's just obviously impersonalized. Like there's nothing individualized about that. I think where the real opportunities are now in the CMS space are probably, well, it's twofold. It's what you bring in and what you take out of the CMS.
Right.
So in terms of bringing in, there's a lot of opportunities to either leverage that information better by turning it into semi-structured or structured data. So being able to take what a whole bunch of your vendors are typing in for their product categories, but then pulling out specific keywords and tags that can then be used in other applications to better target your CMS stuff.
Exactly.
But then also leveraging particularly Gen AI, but there's other options too, to change up the way that the content is being taken out. Just because it's been phrased some way in your CMS doesn't mean that has to be the phrasing that you actually present to the user every single time. You can change that up on the fly even if you need to. The technology is there to be able to do that. I've been trying to think of a good imagery for it. I'm trying to figure out what, if it was a parking lot, what is it now? And it's that, I don't know, in a lot of ways it's almost like a toll booth. Like you have the speeding highway going this way and the speeding highway going after. You have to slow down for a second to make sure you take care of a little bit of business and then you move on. I don't know. I could beat that imagery a lot and be like, well, that funds other options. But really, it's that CMS should be a stop-off point in your larger infrastructure. It shouldn't be this, here's my CMS system and I have other systems that do other things. It's the CMS system is a part of your larger system and it has to work fluidly.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. You mentioned two things, right? So let's go into the first, which is essentially not to think of your CMS as just as a parking lot, but also think about ways you can use or reuse the data that's in your CMS for other purposes. So when we say other purposes, we are mainly talking about personalization purposes, communication purposes, discovery purposes, etc. So should we, go a bit deeper into that? Like, how can companies get started doing?
There's this old saying of garbage in, garbage out. Sure. And a lot of CMSs are filled mostly with garbage, especially if you're in a situation like an e-retailer where your vendors are the ones who are writing up the product descriptions and things like that.
Yeah.
There's no uniformity at all, which makes it very difficult to create a consistent user experience. I mean, even look at something like Amazon, even the titles, just very
crazy,
hugely. In terms of quality, informativeness, even coherence sometimes. But even if you're not basically crowdsourcing your product pages like an retailer would be, say you're a streaming app or a gaming app.
Service, I was going
you still have similar problem in that however you curated your content to decide this is my catalog, there was someone involved in that process to say, here are the buckets of information, and here's how we're going to fill in that information. That may be the title, that may be a short blurb, there may be a longer blurb that tells you more information about the show that you're going to watch.
Sure.
There may be tags associated with it saying what genre it is or which actors appear in it, things like that. All of that information is extremely costly to make consistent. Or it used to be. It used to be very hard because if you wanted to have a clean CMS, you had to have a very clean, rigorous process of feeding information into the CMS.
Right.
That's no longer the case. You can actually do a lot of cleaning on the fly. You can re-clean it in several different ways and decide which one you like better. Like it's not very expensive and it's not very hard to set up, which can then de-garbagify your CMS to a large extent. But also it can allow you to actually extract additional value from it. Yeah. So instead of just saying, oh, my product titles aren't very clean, therefore I'm going to clean them up, which is totally something worth doing, you can say, I'm going to look at my titles and I'm going to pull out brand name. Maybe I didn't have that before. Or maybe I'm going to read the description of the show and like I have the genre, but like even pick like the fantasy genre. There's a lot of different shows that can appear in that. I mean, you've got, and there's some commonalities, but I mean, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are actually three very different kinds of content geared for different audiences, different maturity levels, have a different feel to them. Creating a process, like actually Netflix employs like well over like several dozen people that just go through and obsess over how to tag these things, which is great if you have the finances of Netflix, but if you don't, an LLM can actually do a lot of that kind of stuff. Where you can take a description and say what's the tone of this show? What are some adjectives that could describe the feel of watching it? It could be very, very useful. That can then feed into your experience. You can create filters on that. You can use. I mean, I always harp on reinforcement learning and agentic learning because that's what I do, but you can use those to empower agents to learn that landscape. There's just so many options there that don't require you to like hire an army of people to go through and fix your process and change your data inputs. You can actually change the data you already have to get more value out of it.
Right. So yeah, this is fascinating. So you mentioned that today with LLMs it's become easier to clean your CMS and also to understand the sentiment of the content in your CMS, whether it's product description or longer form content, and then generate tags, generate labels about the content, and then use that as filters to essentially do what? Create like messages, in-app experiences?
I mean, a lot of times when you go to watch a movie, genre is a big bucket. It might not be the best way to search.
Yeah. Right.
Director might not be the best way to search because directors do lots of different shows. So do actors. Maybe being able to pair, like, this is the kind of mood I'm in.
Yeah.
That's a very simple one. That's like straightforward engineering work, not even hard engineering work to basically create their filter. But that you can also take those kinds of things and you can get a much better recommendation system out of leveraging those kinds of tags. If you go on Netflix and you watch Breaking Bad and you like Breaking Bad and you say, okay, well now what connections does that have to other shows? And you're like, oh, Bryan Cranston's in it. You look up Bryan Cranston. The only other show the last time I watched that was on Netflix that Bryan Cranston was in was Kung Fu Panda 3, which is a very, very different show than Breaking Bad. And so, like, being able to create recommendations that can leverage that information. So, yes, it can understand that, okay, these two shows have Bryan Cranston in common. That's fine. But these two shows have the dark theme or perhaps violent motifs in it, things like that. If that's what the kind of mood you're in to watch, you're going to get a much better recommendation by leveraging that data. Again, garbage in, garbage out. If all you tell a machine learning system is that to look at like things like words in the title and the actors and the directors, you're going to get a certain quality of match, but that's not very high quality data to begin with.
Yeah. Right. So this is a great segue into my next question, since you mentioned recommendations, right? So there's been a lot of talk about how LLMs can be used to deliver more personalized content or better recommendations. In fact, I recently saw this post on LinkedIn where someone even suggested that, let LLMs make recommendations. Just feed in the context and your items, your inventory, or whatever you have, whether you're streaming platform or e-commerce or whatever. Then let the LLM tell you what to sort of recommend. So I didn't quite understand how that could sort of come into fruition. It sounds very simplistic. Just let the LLM decide what to recommend. Is that
I,
realistic? Is that? Yeah,
yeah,
I'm sure you have
I
a lot
saw
of
that
opinions.
same, I saw that
Okay,
same LinkedIn post, and it was
I'm sure
it's a, it's
yeah.
a prime example of AI hand waving. Well intentioned. I don't think the guy was trying to pull a fast one or anything. This is what's called the alignment problem in AI.
Okay.
So users have an expectation about what the AI is going to spit out, and then there's what the AI actually spits out, and is the reality aligned with the expectations? In my experience using LLMs, and I don't think this is just me, from other experiences I've read and other research on it, the hardest part of aligning input to output in an LLM is getting the context right. If you could say, yes, I'm going to feed in the context and I'm going to feed in my options for items, LLM pick the best match. Mm-hmm. There are two reasons that won't work. And one of them is that getting that context in there is the thing no one knows how to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not that no one knows how to do it.
It's just very hard. It's
I'll
not.
put in a plug for AMP. AMP knows how to do it because we
Yeah.
have our agents learn that context. That's exactly what they're doing. And in fact, we've had success prototyping and deploying recommenders where we can actually say, for instance, here's the thing we think we should recommend, but we're going to recognize that you care a lot about convenience and cost effectiveness rather than getting best brands and luxury.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're going to frame this recommendation to you in that way. Even in those cases, even with AMP, we still use some form of a more traditional recommender system to actually pick the item instead of using something like an LLM. And that's because of the other reason it's difficult to do is an item recommendation is what you could call a high cardinality problem. So high cardinality is when you have tons and tons and tons of choices to choose from. So if you have only 10 choices to choose from, then yes, assuming that you could fix the context problem and somehow solve that, if you can feed in those 10 options and then the LLM, I don't know, you'd have to test it, but I think it could probably do a reasonable job if you got the context right to be able to pick one from those 10. But how many CMSs only have 10 items? I mean, we have customers with AMP who their CMSs have hundreds of thousands. There's one that even has over 1 million different items.
Yeah.
There's no way to easily feed that, like the attention mechanisms of a transformer model that backs an LLM just aren't suited to be able to sort through all of that information consistently and coherently. Like that would be like reading off the entire catalog to a human and then saying, here's the context, tell me which one I should do. I mean, yes, the LLM has better memory than humans do, but still, that's a lot of stuff to try to figure out what to pay attention to. I'm very optimistic about the application of LLMs to CMSs.
Yeah.
Especially the presentation of the again, the inputs and outputs.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Going in and framing the output going out. In terms of actually making the recommendations, I would still very much go with a more traditional recommender system and instead focus more efforts on figuring out how to define context appropriately. So when the more traditional system does say, this is probably the best item to send to this person, you can make wise decisions about when to show it to them, how to frame it, things like that. If there's multiple image options, which images should you choose? All of those are low cardinality problems. You don't have 1 million types of images. You don't have 1 million different value propositions. You usually have somewhere in the 1 to 2 dozen at most. And so in those cases, that's very well suited to an agentic approach, which will allow you to then pick the right frame, and then you're just inserting the item information. And then that's where I think it would be really useful to use an LLM to transform that on the fly, even populate several options beforehand so you can approve if you're worried about something like brand voice or the LLM not going crazy or anything like that and hallucinating. Like that you can do that with the LLM and create all of that content to be ready to then be appropriate for your context. I think that's a much more realistic way of thinking about that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so you've already answered part of my question, but I'm still going to ask the next question. So let's assume that a brand that's serious about personalization has an agentic system like AMP in place, but now they want to, use LLM. So let's talk about these LLM applications that you've already mentioned. So you first mentioned you can use LLMs can be used to clean your CMS data. So that's one. The second is the LLM can be used to further personalize the recommendation, not the item, but the way it's presented. The presentation can be personalized, right? Am I understanding that correctly? So, the agentic system decides, okay, this item should be recommended, but the LLM can help present that item differently.
Yeah.
It can show me different images. It can show the descriptions differently, based on
Yeah.
who I am. How does that work? So maybe we can first talk quickly about cleaning, and then we can talk about
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
I mean, cleaning's pretty straightforward. Like I said, there's things like, for example, if you're going to send your recommendation through any kind of messaging channel, especially a short form one like, say, push notifications, a large number of just the product titles, the names, are going to be too long to fit into a push notification title. We've had customers who their first inclination was to say, well, that's okay, let's just take the first like 30 characters and use that. But there's two problems. One, it looks kind of weird to have this obviously truncated title where it's like in the middle of a word it splits off. You can fix that and say, okay, only take whole words, so cut it down lower if you need to.
Yeah.
I went through and I showed them how an LLM could clean this, and there was one example that was like I think it was something like a French English dictionary or something like that. And all of the most important words, such as this has to do with French, was actually way past the 30 character mark.
Right.
There was all kinds of information that you wouldn't be able to get, but an LLM could very easily tell that this is the important information that can only fit into 30 characters, and therefore it gives you the most bang for your buck. So there's things like that I think are very, very useful.
Nice.
And then there's, like I said, the data extraction capabilities, which not only help with recommendations, but also, I mean, if you're a streaming service, Amazon actually attributes a huge amount of its success to its just being able to present those kind of tone and feel tags with its shows.
Did you mean Netflix? Because you said Amazon.
Did I say Amazon? I meant Netflix.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that. But every content app, and to some extent, every app is a content app nowadays.
Essentially, you're right. Damn right.
Yeah, but every content app has a discovery problem. I decide, okay, I have some time. Hey, maybe I'd like to watch a show. Now, first of all, I have to decide between Netflix or Amazon Prime or Disney Plus or whatever other apps I have. But then I get into one, and what I'm presented with is a list of lists of lists.
Yeah.
It's like, here's your different genres, or here's the stuff that's playing now, and then I go that, and then there's more, and then there's sub-venues, and what I usually end up doing is I go through and I browse for a while, and more often than not, I get frustrated and say, I'm going to go make myself a sandwich. Instead, I'll spend my time doing that.
Yeah.
Or you say, I'm going to go over to a different app and see what, like, okay, Netflix isn't showing me anything. What's Disney giving me? And I go over there. And now Netflix has lost me. So in those cases, being able to let people browse and very quickly get just a little more information. Because unless I'm like a huge fan of a particular director or a particular actor, presenting that information up front, like right up there with the title, does nothing for me. It doesn't help me make a choice. Because I have no loyalty to any particular performer or director. But I can usually assess what mood I'm in, especially if I see a word and I can say, is that me right now or is it not? Like, it can really help with the decisioning process. Just exposing that information and cleaning and extracting that data becomes fairly easy with an LLM. That's the input side. The output side is a whole different one. You want to talk about that one too?
Yeah, before we get into that, I just want to double click on the data extraction example. And we just talked about Netflix and streaming, but let's say everyone is overwhelmed when trying to book travel, especially hotels or experiences. Can we talk about how the data extraction capabilities can be used to sort of offer more personalized product pages?
This is both on the input and output side. I think it can offer both ways, because the output side is really where I think there's a lot of value for LLMs in the for in the travel space, because if you go to any kind of hotel listing or an Airbnb type listing, anything where you're getting a room, you consistently have this bullet list of all the reasons this thing is good.
Yeah.
Or even worse, a whole undifferentiated paragraph of why this thing is good. And no one reads more than the first 2 bullet list points or the first 2 sentences, if that much.
Yeah.
Now, if you can know, this goes back to defining context, but if you can, through an agentic system or whatever way, learn that this person like when they travel, they tend to travel with their kids. Like they do family travel. That's the kind of stuff they respond well to. Then you want to take that 6th sentence about how it's located conveniently to a bunch of fun attractions, and you want to move that up to the first sentence. And you want to take your 2nd sentence, which is about having a really hot nightlife close by, move that down. There's no reason to do that. You can make some reasonable assumptions about what that is. And that's where the cleaning and extraction can actually be useful too. There's actually several sites that do this, where you'll look at a hotel and it will have a little badge on it that says family friendly.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. If you don't already have that, or if you wonder if those tags have been applied consistently, because who knows which team that no longer exists in your company was responsible for tagging those, you can actually have an LLM go through and make those judgments. They're decent at making those kinds of judgments. So you can summarize the data in very small bits and tag it just the same way Netflix tags movies. But I think the real potential, and I think this is going to, in the near future, make the difference between companies that retain their users and companies who lose their users to those other companies, is going to be presenting this information in a way that doesn't make you waste your time as a user. I don't want to dig down through 6 sentences to find out whether this hotel is close to the attractions that I want to take my kids to. Or if I'm traveling for business, I don't want to have to search through a whole paragraph to figure out that there's a lot of convenient dining options, so I don't have to take a cab to somewhere where I'm going to be able to eat. But those are the kinds of things that someone could easily learn about me just through my interaction, not any kind of like ad tech spying on all of... They don't have to understand my entire browsing behavior on the internet to be able to do that. They could just look at how I interact with that one app. It's all owned information. I'm never surprised when an app is going to track my browsing behavior in the app. That's how the app functions.
Yeah.
And so it wouldn't take that long to learn that kind of stuff about me, and to be able to then present that information front and center. And in fact, again, one of my other plugs for agentic learning is you can actually even agentically learn the ordering of bullet points.
Yeah.
Because if those, that's just a matter, it's a more complex action space for an agent to learn. Just to make sure we're understanding terminology. So an agent learns by exploring what's called an action space, which is really just different categories of actions it could take. So if you're exploring the value proposition action space, then you have one action which is talk about convenience. One action is talk about fast delivery. One action is to talk about low price, things like that. So that's a fairly simple action space. It's one-dimensional. It's just you got, I don't know, 5 to 15 different value propositions.
Yeah.
And that right there, yes, like you could learn that, okay, this person cares about family-friendly travel and good restaurants.
Yeah.
Therefore, that's what I'm going to put up. But what you could also do is you could create a more complex action space of, does this person prefer family-friendly in the first slot, the first bullet point? Do they prefer family-friendly in the second bullet point? Do they prefer good restaurants in their first point? And it creates a bigger action space, so it takes a little bit longer for an agent to learn it, although there's ways around it by having agents talk to one another and share information. And to make good guesses based on what works for the majority of people. But by learning that interaction, you could actually dynamically create that list in the proper order to put their best value propositions, their most effective value propositions first for that individual user. That wouldn't even require an LLM. You could use it. You could use an LLM to do it.
Yeah.
A lot of companies are understandably worried about brand voice. It's one of the major concerns people have with trusting LLMs, and it's a totally legitimate concern. LLMs are not yet to the point where they have common sense, especially in certain domains, and probably won't for a good amount of time. You can train them more, but they lack certain key human capabilities. They mimic some parts of the human brain, but not others. That's a different topic. You could use an LLM to do it, But if you're really worried about brand voice or consistency, or just being, even if you just have an approval chain, like you're not allowed to put something on the product page unless someone else looks at it first, you could actually pre-create all of these and then just have the agents learn them. And then it's just a matter of, instead of one slot in your CMS for a product category, you actually have dozens or maybe even hundreds of slots. And the agent is just picking which slot to put in which place for a particular user as they come to the page. That, I mean, a few years ago, that would have been like, man, I have to devote like an entire research team of engineers to figuring out how to do this. But now that is well within the realm of just out-of-the-box solutions.
Yeah. As you were talking about the value propositions, I couldn't stop thinking about food delivery and grocery delivery because, like, I'm always looking at sustainable options, a little obsessed there, and it's hard. It's hard to really find because at least the apps that I'm used to, they don't really show whether a restaurant is using sustainable packaging or not, or the garbage bags I'm using, are they truly sustainable or not? And there's so many different types, you know. I once spent half an hour just trying to understand the different garbage bags that are being sold on Amazon to figure out which one's actually compostable. Because all of them will say environmentally friendly, but what does that even mean? Right?
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. That's like calling something organic, at least in the U.S. The regulations on those things just don't mean a whole lot, and so you have to dig down further. Speaking of food delivery, I have that problem consistently because I can't eat gluten. And finding gluten-free options is a landmine. It has caused me actually to order out much less than I used to, which who knows, maybe that's a healthier lifestyle for me, but it's not good for the services that are selling takeout. But the thing is, that's something an LLM could actually make a pretty good guess about. It's always buyer beware, but I mean, a little information is always better than no information.
Right.
And like being able to take that kind of information out from a food delivery app, like it doesn't take a lot of complex knowledge to know that pad thai typically is naturally gluten-free. And like I know that, but there are lots of other options out there that I don't have a lot of experience with that I'm not sure. Most food delivery apps, you go in there and all the filters are the same that they've been for 10 years. It's how close is it? What's the price? What's the rating for the restaurant? What's the cuisine? And then some of them have several other options like family friendly or seniors or things like that. But it feels like they've just sort of thrown in a bunch of keywords. There's a lot of room there to make that experience so much more user friendly. User experiences that are even just a little bit of like, that little bit of friction is going to have outsized impact going forward. Like users used to have this expectation that there would be some friction. Like you got to work through it and because I want this thing. But there are so many alternative options now. When you look at food delivery, there are tons of options to do just do food delivery or get groceries, things like that. That you introduce a little bit of friction there and that's a win for your competitors. It's not just that you're losing your user, it's that you're losing them to benefit someone that you're competing against in the market. Users are becoming more and more impatient with those little bits of friction.
Yeah. I think companies are responsible there with quick commerce and 15-minute delivery. You know, people are not going to plan ahead. You know, they realize they want something and they want it quickly, and they expect it to arrive quickly. So it just makes it easier if you for people like me, if you just make it easy to sort of find what I'm really looking for. Cool. So far we've mostly talked about how to take what's already in your CMS and make it better, right? But are there things that people should be putting into their CMS that they currently aren't? Like, can a CMS be made more valuable, not just as a source of content, but also as a destination?
Yeah, a whole lot of companies have blog posts. Tons of blog posts. They can't remember all the blog posts they've written. And a lot of them are actually really relevant to the content they sell. If you're trying to get someone to buy sunglasses, being able to point them to content you own about like how to care for your glasses properly actually could be a really good way of enticing someone who's simply not going to respond to a here's a sale, buy now kind of message. That turns off a lot of people. Whereas they may be very open to, hey, here's some interesting information for you. Being able to pull that in and match it with your item inventory. So you can think of it as having two CMSs. You have your blog CMS and then you have your items CMS and being able to marry that up. There's actually a lot of ways that you could pull in customer reviews if you collect those, or even if you can pull them from an aggregation site. I mean, think of all the information that is available about a movie on Netflix, which by and large like does this pretty well. But then compare that to the amount of information about that same movie on IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
There's huge amounts of information there
Yeah.
that can be pulled in, and just presenting all that information just to make it available just exacerbates the discovery problem. It's like, okay, now I used to have to read half a page, now I have to read 5 pages to decide whether I want to watch this movie. That's not going to work. But if you've already decided that this movie is probably a good bet for this user, being able to pull in and say, an actual live person said this about this movie, or it gets these types of ratings, that kind of information, like, you don't even necessarily have to collect that yourself. There's a lot of options out there. This is something companies have been doing a long time for their data science teams, where they will buy third-party data, but that information ends up being used as like features in models and things like that, which honestly I think is it's a high cost for low return on investment in most cases. What to use as a data science tool, like a lot of times that kind of information is already somewhat pre-aggregated, and it's not very useful for most data scientists, but it could be extremely useful for the product. To not create a model that creates some kind of better prediction, but rather just say, I've already have my model, this is the prediction it is, and I'm going to sell it. And I'm going to sell it by pulling in this other information that talks about it, that presents it in a compelling way, that shows its value, that is beyond just the stuff that we've put into our CMS just to keep track of what content we have. I think there's tons of potential there. There's a lot of possibilities in that space that people haven't even begun to tap.
Do you have any tips for people on how they can get started pulling all this data, particularly from external sources, into their CMS?
That does require some data science or engineering work to do the matching. That's actually one of the reasons we decided to build an agentic learning system with AMP. Was a lot of these engineering and data science teams in these companies are spending all their time doing things that a machine could do probably just as easily. But pulling in this information and figuring out a good way to match it to exactly what you have is actually something a machine can't do very well. It's something that probably needs a bespoke solution in many cases. Eventually, I'm sure that someone will find a way to package it and commoditize it. But right now, that would be a great thing to have some of your tech people work on. But no one has the time for it because they're doing all the things that our agents are busy doing for other people. You need to figure out where you're going to free up some space. And doing that kind of matching, in some cases, it's fairly easy. A lot of times, like, for instance, with movies, there's usually some kind of a unique identifier that's actually shared across the industry. That doesn't require a data scientist. That just requires a little bit of time. But in other cases, yeah, it's going to take some judgment calls, maybe leveraging an LLM, for instance, figuring out if you're trying to match up your blog content with your item CMS. You could actually use an LLM to get you at least part of the way, if not all the way, to say, here are the different categories of items. I'm going to give you a blog post. Tell me which category it belongs to. You now, instead of having to potentially match that blog to 10,000 different things, you now have to match it to 300. And then you could go through and do it again and winnow it down until you figure out which ones are good. That's, again, that kind of prompt engineering is something that requires someone who is savvy enough to understand LLMs and how to prompt engineer and can probably code a little bit. Like, that's actually a really good use case for someone to work on. But again, like most companies, they're like, I don't have the capacity to do that. My engineers are working on too many other things. That's because your engineers are busy doing things that they don't really need to do, because an agent could do it just as well.
Yeah. Great.
That was my shameless plug for agentic learning.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay, so last question. How does a really robust CMS interact with an agentic system? I can see that better content makes for a better recommendation system. I also see how agents choosing the order in which, say, a product description is listed in order to personalize the experience is helpful. But can you think of any other agentic applications that can increase the value of a CMS?
This is one of my what do I call them? Soapboxes. I tend to get feisty about this one because I think it's
okay. Great.
It's important. And it's a thing that, in retrospect, it seems so obvious that it's a good idea. If you take a recommender system, that recommender system is basically a hypothesis about what generates preferences. So if you create a recommender system take a dead simple one, that say you're a food app, and it's just going to say, I'm going to find each person's cuisine preference, and I will randomly pick some some item from that cuisine. The hypothesis there is cuisine matters a lot. Like the difference between a 4-star and a 3-star restaurant is much smaller than the difference between a Thai restaurant and an Italian restaurant. Whereas another one, you could actually have the opposite hypothesis, which is I'm going to pick a 4-star restaurant and recommend that. If you go to like Yelp or something, they usually have it in dollar signs. So there's $1 sign, $2 sign, $3 signs, $4 signs. There are many people who have a definite preference for the $1 sign. They're looking for something inexpensive. They're traveling for work. They're on a per diem. They don't want to spend too much, or they're with their kids. Other people are definitely looking for a $4 sign. So that could be another recommender hypothesis, is that they have a preference for a particular price bracket for their tastes. You have more complicated recommender systems like a collaborative filtering system, which is saying really their preference is this complex thing, and so I'm going to infer their preference by looking at where it overlaps with other people. But in all cases, every single one of those systems is a different hypothesis about what is generating their preference. The idea that you would take one of them, even a complex one like a collaborative filtering system, and say that's what generates every single person's preference just doesn't make any sense. There are some people who really do order pad thai every Friday night. That's just what they do. Not every Friday night, most Friday nights. If they did it every Friday night, there's no reason to message them about that. But if they do it most Friday nights, then you send it on Friday night to keep it up. That is revenue coming in. Going there and using a more complicated system doesn't actually make sense in that case. So where I think a really promising avenue for agentic learning is actually to tag, like agents learn on tags. So you tag different product categories, tag different value propositions. Those tags are the space that it learns. You can tag recommender systems where you can learn that this user has a preference for brand loyalty. They tend to buy a lot from a particular brand. Pick something from that brand, recommend that to them. That's actually going to matter a lot more than trying to pick the right price bracket or trying to do something more complicated. This person actually has much more complex preference profile. They aren't always loyal to a brand. They don't always care about price. Therefore, collaborative filtering, a better option for them. Another person is always shopping for the newest stuff. They spend a lot of time browsing. They've seen a lot of the stuff. So if you can give them new content, they are more likely to engage. So recommend something like that. And so you can have the agents experiment with recommendations generated through different processes, and then you can actually go through and pick the right one for each user. We did this with a food delivery customer who works with us. They had 4 different recommenders that actually their data science team had created. We didn't even create them ourselves. We have several out of the box that AMP customers can just use, but we also allow you to plug in your own. And their original question was, can you help us figure out which one of these we should use? Our answer was that's the wrong question. You shouldn't figure out one that you should use. We did find that one did perform hands down better than the others. In terms of successful recommendations, it accounted for a good, I think, 50% of all of the purchases. But their worst performing recommender actually was the only recommender that worked for around 8% of their users. Meaning if they didn't have that recommender, they wouldn't have seen the success with those users, even though they had the 3 higher performing recommenders working. That's the problem with doing something like a traditional A/B test approach. A/B testing tells you what works for the largest minority of users. And to go with that and say, that's what I'm going to not just give to the majority, but get to everyone. Everyone gets that experience is just a bad idea. Using agents to learn recommender preferences, it doesn't solve the problem. It makes it into a non-problem. It's not even an issue anymore. You can actually learn which one of those preferences belong to which of your users, and that can change over time because their habits can change. Someone could certainly develop brand loyalty where they hadn't before. Someone could get introduced to Korean food for the first time in their life and become obsessed with it. And those recommendations could then change very easily. In addition to all of the agentically learning, the framing and the way you present it, all stuff like that, I think being able to pick which system you're going to use to generate those recommendations for each user is the future of recommendation systems.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. My brain is now already thinking of so many things. The way you explained everything was really good. When you mentioned like Patha every Friday. I couldn't stop thinking about Sheldon Cooper. So,
Yeah.
if people have people like Sheldon Cooper as customers, then sure, they shouldn't use a recommender system because Sheldon sticks to his routine, pizza
Yeah.
night is pizza night, but there aren't many Sheldon-like people in the world, right? So,
Yeah, but there are some, and there's no reason that they should be ignored just because they're a small minority. Like, the beauty of an agentic system is that there's no niche too small. You can cater to all of them. You wouldn't be able to do that with a human team because your head count isn't high enough to devote that kind of granular attention. But agents can scale. You can have as many as you want. You can have one per user, and therefore you can devote that attention.
yeah, yeah, awesome. We've been talking about CMSs, and we've also been talking about inputs and outputs, right? Like for your CMS. So can you clarify that, because I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to as an input
Sure.
and as an output.
So I would consider an input anything that lives in your CMS.
Right.
So of course your item IDs, your item names, item descriptions, all of that is in there. If you were to pull in external information, such as linking in which blog posts are relevant to this item, or you pull in customer ratings or reviews and bring that in, that's also inputs. Even if you went in to your CMS and extracted tags that talk about the tone or any other information about the item, that would still be an input in my thinking, because those tags would then reside within the CMS. They all live there to be then served up whenever you need them. Your output is never your whole CMS. Your output is you look at the CMS through whatever process you decide this thing is something I want to present. They've gone to this item's webpage. I need to present that item information. Or my recommender system says this item is what's good for them. Let's send that to them. You then pull out that information, and there's lots of questions about when you present it, how you present it, how are you going to frame it, what's the wording going to be, what's the order, all of that kind of stuff. Those are all of the output decisions. An end user never sees an input directly. Right. They never see your actual CMS. That's all stuff that your engineers and your product teams see. The output is what your end user sees.
Okay. But then if the end user is shown some tags, as you see on Netflix or whatever, then that's an output.
Yes. Well, they were shown those tags. How you show those tags is an output. The only reason you can show them the tags is because they were in your CMS in the first place. So at some point they were an input. Inputs flow into outputs. I guess the reason I see the distinction as useful is that in a lot of cases it may not make sense to store, for example, the order in which you are going to present an item in your CMS, because that should change. That should be able to change.
Right.
So storing that doesn't make sense for that to be an input. That's a total output. Whereas item title, yes, at one point it has to have been an input. You have to have entered it in. But the sizing of the title, where it's presented on the page, are you presenting a shortened version of it, things like that, those are all output considerations.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.